God has brought his people out of slavery before in Egypt, and that was a sort of resurrection. And so Isaiah will also point to a return and some kind of a resurrection for the people. I'm tempted when reading just to skip to the lovely Jesus bits, skip to the people walk in darkness have seen a great light. And some of what we see is this dark backdrop against which the glories of these gospel promises shine.
Hello, welcome to the Bible OverBrew with me, Rachel Redeemed, and Matt Searles. I'm so excited. We are in Isaiah. We have made it this far. We are following Hebrew Bible order, if you're just jumping in. So this is our 17th episode. We are doing chapters 1 to 23, with the keep chapters being 1 and 2, 6, and 11 and 12. TheBibleOverbrew.com has all those numbers and hopefully some good notes and questions to steer you. But it is the Bible and the Overbrew. So, Matt, is there a check for both of those things with you?
There's a check for both those things, and Rachel, I'm doubly excited today. We're Isaiah, which I think might be my favourite Bible book. Which
cool.
Yeah, it's a close run thing, but love a bit of Isaiah. And I've got some decaf tea that I enjoy. I don't sleep very well, so trying to cut down on the caffeine. And normally decaf tea tastes a little bit like you've washed out a mackerel boat, collected the water and heated it. Yeah, I've not been a fan. Yeah, I mean, doesn't that sound pleasant? But I found a brand, probably shouldn't say it on air, but I found a brand that tastes like tea. So right. I'm super excited. Isaiah, good cup of tea. Yeah, what have you got, Rachel?
Joining me in the non-caffeine world, similarly, I cannot cope with it. Something that has lots of things in it, so I will spare you all of them, but mainly strawberry and blueberry. Let's stop there for no one falling asleep.
Like the extended cut where you list your tea in full.
List the lot. Poor listener. I have compassion. But I'm stoked, partly because I know you had a cheeky devotional in Isaiah come out. So also we get to have 3 whole sessions looking at Isaiah, and it's a bit of a wasteland for me. I know the old Christmas passage. I know the bit in Isaiah 6 where you get King Uzziah dies, and then you get the whole hot coal thing. But the rest of it, oh yeah, suffering servant, that's something else we got in there, bit of Jesus stuff. But reading this and listening to it, I did both, and it's been bonkers. I've seen so much. There's a ton going on. There's a lot of hard things, there's a lot of exciting things. So I'm pumped for this. But the story so far must first commence. It's probably my turn, actually. So shall we? I'm saying that like it's a bad thing. I feel I should confess to how nervous it makes me, but I think it's such a good exercise. I do think it is so helpful to get our heads around it. In the spirit of that, let us have a crack. Right. In the beginning, we have a God who wants a relationship with humans, and we have that in the Garden of Eden, and it's beautiful. God and humans relating well. But humans rebel. We're cast out of the garden, down out of Eden, because a holy God cannot dwell with an unholy people. We then get a second go with Noah. Still messes up in a garden, doesn't work out. We need more than a do-over. We're going to need something a bit more than that. So we track these promises with a chap called Abraham. He is amazingly given so much grace, especially for being, he does a lot of not great things. So we get him getting a promise of land, people, and blessing. We then follow some of his kids, generations. So Abraham, Isaac, also does some good things, some bad things, and Jacob, who I feel is often a missed character, other than often being a ratbag as well as the others. He turns up a lot in Isaiah, turns out. Then we have the Exodus, this big showdown between a godlike figure, a serpent-like figure, and we have Yahweh absolutely wiping the floor with that mackerel-tasting water being washed out as they go through the Red Sea. And alas, Numbers being full of grumblers, they don't go into the promised land. So they've got the people, but they haven't got the land. And are they in God's blessing? Well, they've been given a way to relate to him, and unholy people are then given a lot of ways in which to connect and be in the presence of a holy God. We get that whole shenanigans go around the wilderness. They do end up going into the promised land through another body of water, and we then have them not quite following God's instructions, and they're not obedient, and then tragically it goes downhill over a number of years. but very fast downhill. Seeing what happens when you have no good king and the people doing whatever they want. We see a sort of have a go at a king with Saul. I mean, he is a king, but he's just not. He's the people want one that isn't after what God thinks is priorities. So it doesn't work out so good. But we do get David again, still not doing all the great things, but does do some good things, and is indeed the type of which we see some themes coming through from the line of Jesse as we get to Isaiah, who was his dad. I think that takes us up to somewhere near where we are. I think there's still more to go. And then we end up jumping into the prophets, which hopefully you can help us get our heads around a little bit.
And so helpful to mention David, son of Jesse, because actually Jesse will come up. And so when we see the root of Jesse in Isaiah, we need to remember, okay, that's David's dad. And so as we read Isaiah, I mean, two things you've mentioned, the Exodus, that's going to be pretty important. We'll look for Exodus language, and actually all the prophets there'll be David language, sort of kingship language. And I hadn't spotted actually until you said it, but actually in Isaiah often it's Jesse that gets referred to his dad, but it's that royal line. We're doing the Hebrew Bible order. I think firstly it reads better that way because you don't finish the history in Kings and then go back and basically do that same history again in Chronicles. Chronicles is a second telling of the history, which we will cover right at the end of the Old Testament. So I think for reading through it makes sense. But also the prophets, as in the writing prophets, sort of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, etc., they are something of a sort of a commentary on the history. Actually, they occur in the narrative. We've come across Isaiah, if we've been reading carefully. He does pop up in, is it 2 Kings? Just briefly with Hezekiah. But the prophets call people back to God's covenant. The prophets, perhaps in our kind of modern culture, we think is about predicting the future. In a very kind of, one day there will be this and there'll be that, and it's just this very long range thing. The prophets did far more than that. They did predict the future, and we'll see prophecies. The virgin will be with child or give birth to a son whose name will be called Emmanuel. But there's lots that the prophets do, which is simply calling the people back to the covenant. Remember, covenant is that relationship. I loved how you started. God wants a relationship with his people. The covenants were the formalization of what that was to look like. And so the prophets will call people back and say, wait a minute, as God's people, this is how you're supposed to live, but you're living like this. That's not right. And back in Deuteronomy, it said, hey, if you persist in turning away from me, you'll be cast out of the land. And so really the prophets just pick up those themes. And even as they do predict new things for the future, much of it is just in continuity with the story so far. Almost we can imagine the prophets are the ones who are saying, hey, read your Bibles, guys. Don't you remember what God's like? Don't you remember what he said? So they sort of hold up something of a mirror to what the people are like, remind the people of God's promises. But as they do, sort of it's like a dimmer switch is maybe turned up. We start to see more of what these promises look like. And particularly Isaiah, I love. I mean, lots of the prophets are not the most immediately accessible books. But in Isaiah, we see so many promises, so many prophecies of hope that form such the backdrop to the New Testament. The early church would call Isaiah the 5th gospel because it points so clearly to Jesus.
Cool.
Admittedly, today we'll see some of that. I think that will only increase in our next 2 episodes in Isaiah. So we're in this funny position that we've read through all the history, and actually we've read about the exile. Check out the last episode 16, if that's unfamiliar, because that will be important, because Isaiah will talk about that. The exile was when the people got sent out of the land to the east, a new kind of Eden type moment because of their sin. They got taken off into Babylon. Isaiah actually is 100 or so years before that, but much of Isaiah's message is judgment is coming because of your sin, judgment of exile. But then Isaiah will also have prophecies of hope after the exile. So we need to sort of take ourselves back. Isaiah's one of the earlier prophets. So we're back as we're on this sort of decline, but we haven't quite got to the people going to exile yet. And the prophets, Isaiah, one of them, is calling people, warning them of their sin, warning them of judgment to come. But then we'll see some wonderful promises of hope as well.
I think I found that coming back to this, having seen all that we have so far, the harder bits made a bit more sense because we'd seen what happened. So I found it where there was previously when I've looked at Isaiah, just being like, there's just so much judgment. But now I'm a bit like, yeah. I kind of felt this one when I was going through it. My emotions were really quite closely tied with what I was reading, and it was, yeah, quite emotional. Being, I guess, more understanding of God's goodness and His character and how much compassion He's had up until this point. I mean, still through this point, having dismantled a few of the lies I've believed about God so far, coming to this text has felt less overwhelming, perhaps. So yeah, thanks for the first 16 episodes that have teed me up for this. But help us get into those first key chapters, 1 and 2. What should we be keeping our eyes out for here?
There's a lot going on, and we'll see this with many of the prophets. We sort of get this indictment on the people, this description of the people's sin, and then the judgment that will follow. 1 verse 2, the Lord speaks of how his people, the Lord has spoken, I reared children and brought them up, but they've rebelled against me. It's sort of covenant, it's relationship language. It's not these people have transgressed some sort of arbitrary standard out there.
Yeah.
The kind of a list of rules that no one really knew about or cared about, like breaking some old law that I didn't still know that you weren't allowed to graze your pig on the on the common or like it's not it's very personal. Sin is really relational so often in the prophets, and so even as it's the strong judgment, it's actually these people who were my children. I brought them into relationship with me, but they're a brood of evildoers, children given to corruption. Verse 4, 1 verse 4. They've forsaken the Lord. Again, that's a relational language. They've spurned the Holy One of Israel and turned their backs on him. And so it's a tragic picture. The Lord is rightly angry at sin. Particularly as we read on, we'll see that actually what this meant was often mistreatment of the poorest in society, often injustice, oppression. And actually, when we've read the history, we've seen these things. God is rightly angry, but it's not an anger of a, that's it, I'm done with these people, but almost we can almost hear the sadness in that. An anger at sin, but also at why have you turned from me and something so good to something so tragic? And so we see lots of descriptions of the people's sin. And actually, just flicking to chapter 5, verse 13, therefore my people will go into exile. Again, we've seen it, and this will be taken off to Babylon. My people will go into exile for lack of understanding. Those of high rank will die of hunger. The common people will be parched with thirst. Exile was a horrible thing. It was an awful thing to be conquered by a foreign nation. Really interesting how it's then described in the next verse. Therefore, death expands its jaws, opening wide its mouth. Into it will descend their nobles and masses. My people will go into exile. They'll be taken off to Babylon. Theologically, what's that? Well, that's death. Because God is a God of life. To be cast away from God, it's a sort of death of the nation. It's actually Genesis 3 again. God said, when you eat of that fruit, you will surely die. Well, what happened actually is they were sent away from God. Actually, exile is a sort of death. And so that will be the judgment in Isaiah. Also, that will point to the hope, because remember, wait a minute, God has brought his people out of slavery before in Egypt, and that was a sort of resurrection. And so Isaiah will also point to a return and some kind of a resurrection for the people. I'm tempted when reading just to skip to the lovely Jesus bits, skip to the people walking in darkness have seen a great light, and miss the walking in darkness. And some of what we see is that this dark backdrop against which the glories of these gospel promises shine.
I feel I really spotted, again, your notes are very helpful on this, but seeing the references to the proud and the lofty being humbled and brought low. I feel we've seen that a number of times, this kind of reversal, but actually going through, I was circling the word lofty, it came up a lot. 2 verse 12, it literally says that against all that is proud and lofty, against all that is lifted up, it shall be brought low. You kind of see that expanded throughout this these first early chapters in particular, I felt. But we do get to the dramatic telling of Isaiah 6 and his vision of the Lord. This is probably one of my favourite visions. In the year that the king Uzziah died, he saw the Lord sitting on a throne. He's high and lifted up, and the train of his robes fills the temple. And then there's some seraphim above him. So seraphim begins with an S, 6 wings. And we've then got them calling to one another, and they're saying, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory." In Hebrew, the more you repeated something, the more of a big deal it was. So to have a thrice holy God here is a big, 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 big deal. And then the whole place starts shaking, there's smoke, and then Isaiah's saying, "Woe to me! I'm ruined. I'm a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty." Then you get one of the seraphim flying down with a coal, which he's just taken out of the altar with a pair of tongs, and he touches it to his mouth and says, "See, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin atoned for." And then he hears the voice of the Lord saying, "Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?" And then a classic passage some of us may know, "Here I am, send me." And then he gives them a message, but it may be not the message that we might expect. I'm getting carried away here. Matt, back to you.
I think in an episode way back, you used the phrase sort of immersive theatre, and this is that this sense of just the majesty and the size. The temple pretty big, but the train of God's robe fills it. I mean, just the very end of his robe fills the temple. How much bigger is God? Yeah, it all kind of shakes. It was interesting. It's lovely having just done the story so far, and you mentioned the whole kind of Sinai and shaking, and it's one of those dramatic encounters with God moments that we've seen before, and so maybe we hark back to that. And I think this is really important for the book, because really what Isaiah gets is what the people need, and actually what we need, which is just a massive view of God. I love Isaiah because I think it paints the biggest picture of God probably anywhere in the Bible, certainly anywhere in the Old Testament, particularly chapters 40 to 48 that we'll look at in the next episode. Isaiah just has any small view of God just exploded and expanded in this wonderful way. I pray for my heart that's what Isaiah, the book, will do for us as we read. Massive view of God in his glory and majesty. He gets a deeper view of his own sin. Faced with a God like that, he's just aware, I'm sinful, the people are sinful. And actually I think that's something that all the people would need, and Christians today. Isaiah doesn't minimize human sin. Actually, it says sin is a real problem because of how offensive it is to God, because of how awful it is to other people. And so Isaiah gets this conviction of sin. But it doesn't end there. Conviction of sin is for a purpose. This wonderful provision, this coal from the altar. What's the altar? Well, that's the place that sacrifices were made. That's the place where sacrifices were offered that would deal with sin. And of course, that's pointing us to Jesus. The angel applies these sacrifices, applies the work of the altar to Isaiah, and says sin is dealt with. And then actually Isaiah is then ready to go and serve the Lord. And actually those three things, this massive view of God, the book of Isaiah will paint that for us. I think the book of Isaiah will also convict us of our sin and remind us of the seriousness of sin, not to make us despondent, but to drive us to the full, sufficient, glorious, delightful provision of God, of forgiveness of sin, and I mean, so much more than that, a forgiveness of sin that is world transforming, is life giving. The pictures of God's relationship with his people in later chapters is just wonderful. So what Isaiah got really summarizes the book as a whole, and it's what the people needed, those three things.
Hallelujah. Yes, please. And even again, when you have this bit at the end of chapter 6, we get this stump remaining from a tree that's been cut down, and you're there like, oh, remnant, like there's still something, even when it's been previously described as terrible. These pops of hope and promise, I feel, have been even more shiny to me. Perhaps doing it for me in bigger chunks means I'm not just focusing on 4 chapters of judgment. I'm seeing a bit more as we go, of these moments of light and joy. So on from chapter 7, in the notes you helpfully say, who are we supposed to be trusting and who are we supposed to be fearing? Can you help us get our heads around that for this next section?
Isaiah is one of those books, if we don't know something of the historical context, we can easily get lost, because we just get judgment on Babylon, judgment on Assyria, judgment on Tyre, and we think, what, why, who, like, okay, what relevance? The big sort of question in Isaiah really is who do you trust? Who do you fear? That is, who do you see as most powerful, and therefore who do you trust? And there's two kings. We won't get into all the details, but two kings occur in Isaiah: Ahaz and Hezekiah. As we've seen in the history of 1 and 2 Kings, little Israel and little Judah were between these superpowers of Assyria, Babylon, Egypt, often getting attacked on various sides. And the question is, when that happens, what do you do? Who do you trust? So Assyria are the main sort of superpower in Isaiah's day. And so King Ahaz, when the Assyrians come to attack, King Ahaz thinks, the Assyrians are attacking. What can I do? Well, I need to make an alliance with Egypt. Egypt, which is the grave in biblical thought, rather than trusting the Lord. So he's a Mr. sort it out in my own strength guy, Ahaz, not trust the Lord. He fears the nations. He thinks the nations are more powerful than God, and so he tries to build alliances. Later in Isaiah 38 or so, chapter 38, which we won't look at today, but Hezekiah, again, the Assyrians come and attack. Hezekiah, rather than looking to who else can I look to for help, says, well, I'm going to go to the Lord. And actually, that's where in the book of Kings we see him talking with Isaiah, and they pray. They pray, and the Lord delivers them. And so this question, who do you trust, which is really to do with who do you think is most powerful? This applies for us as Christians today. If we've got a very small view of God, when circumstances come and look really big and threatening, in Isaiah's day it was these foreign powers, Assyria, etc. When circumstances look big, and if our vision of God is smaller than them, we'll think, I need to sort this out in my own strength. I need to look here, I need to look there, I need to do all these things to make life okay. The book of Isaiah is, I think, intended to show that people actually we have a God who is greater than the circumstances. If we fear him, that is, if we see him as the really mighty one, and read through Isaiah and see he's a God who's utterly committed to his people. If we see God as the mighty one, more powerful than anything else that comes our way, then in distress we turn first to him and we trust him. Lots of what's going on in Isaiah is both a magnifying God, showing the greatness of God, and also discouraging trust in other things. And so, yeah, that's what a lot of this language in Isaiah is about. Let the Lord be the one that you fear. Let him be the one that you trust. And I guess it's in that context that we get some of these wonderful prophecies of Christ. Chapter 7, chapter 9. Don't know if you want to just talk to us about some of these wonderful little nuggets of Jesus-ness in Isaiah.
It is when, you're going through at some speed and you're just like, now who, now what, now, oh, I recognize this one. This is Christmas. So I've drawn a nice little Christmas tree in my Bible, pointing us to a coming king. Isaiah 9, we've got verse 2, the people walking in darkness have seen a great light. It's just, it's when it is this bleak and this dark, it's hard not to just hear it with Christmas, the equivalent of hearing it with goggles on. You know what I mean? But to know actually that verse 3, you've enlarged the nation, bells ringing for fruitfulness, be fruitful and multiply. And then on to verse 6, you get, for to us a child is born. Again, it's so weird. You're like, wait, what? After all this, I've just talked about like
all these mighty nations coming against you. What's God's answer?
A kid. You're like, what? Come again? Okay. To us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the greatness of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. This is incredible. And we've got the throne of David again. Just right after that, we then just get this bit that there's going to be judgment here. The Lord has sent a message against Jacob. It will fall on Israel. The judgment happens before we get this king. You're kind of on the highest mountaintop and then you're, deep into the darkness. For, verse 18, for wickedness burns like a fire. It's dark and bleak and not to be taken lightly.
And I think that points us to a tension we've sort of seen in the Bible so far. Back in Exodus 34, I think it is, we get the name of God, the Lord, gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love. Goes on, but who will not leave the guilty unpunished. And we might think, sorry, God, wait a minute, how do those two fit together?
Yep.
We're glad that God is those things. We're glad, at one level, he's a God who doesn't just go sin, iniquity, oppression, injustice. That's fine. He
Mm.
takes it really seriously. He takes offense against himself seriously because he is holy, holy, holy.
Mm.
But also has these promises of love and compassion and grace. And in Isaiah, we see those. And I think really Isaiah kind of delays the punchline a little bit
Mm.
until we get to, what I guess, Isaiah 53, where we
Mm.
see there will be a servant who will be pierced for our transgressions. He will be crushed for our
Mm.
iniquity. So the early chapters of Isaiah say sin deserves judgment, and judgment of a very serious kind. Let's not think sin is a small thing.
Mm.
But to this sinful people, it's like people, the kids who've been just bullying the younger kids at school and being
Mm.
awful. They haul to the principal's office. But to those rebellious people, you get these promises. By the way, I have a future for you that is more wonderful than you could ever imagine. That the Christmas passage you've
Mm.
just read. I think seeing that passage in the light of the awful wickedness and
Mm.
judgment, we go, the amazing promises of hope, but yet judgment must still fall. And how does that all
Mm.
fit? And the shape of Isaiah will show is actually it's only after judgment has fallen can these promises
Mm.
be fulfilled. But then Isaiah will point beyond just Israel. The people in Isaiah's day, they did go into exile, they did suffer this death.
Mm.
But actually, the wonderful hope is as Christians, we will have one who will take that exile for us. We will have someone who will suffer that death for us. And so,
Mm.
so in Christ, that's how God can both be a God who doesn't leave any sin unpunished,
Mm.
but also a God who is gracious and compassionate to his people. When we don't just cherry pick Isaiah for the sort of the most beautiful gospel passages, when we
Mm.
see the whole, even though it's hard, and even though some of it aren't enjoyable to read, all the judgment, we go,
Mm.
wow, this is the glory of God. That this judgment that we deserve for the sin that we know is in our hearts, that can be laid on another so that I can know these promises. I
Mm.
think that it just turns up the color, the brightness on the gospel when we actually read it all in context like that.
And in chapters 11 and 12, I have so many scribblings. I have much underlinings and a little arrow that says Eden vibes. There's also stuff about a new king and an exodus. Can you talk us through those?
You helpfully in the story so far mentioned David being the son of Jesse. Chapter 11 opens, a shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. David was promised in 2 Samuel 7, was promised a house. He was promised he would have a sort of a dynasty, a succession of kings, but particularly
Mm.
one king who would reign forever. And the hopes of the
Mm.
people were pinned on the Davidic kings. But we see a sort of a downward progression until eventually the people get sent into exile, and there is no king, at least for a while.
Mm.
This house, or change better for this Davidic tree, like a family tree, is a
Mm.
stump. It looks like, well, maybe that's going to be over when the people are in
Mm.
Babylon. There's no king, but
Mm.
God says no. The stump of Jesse, David's house is still intact. There will come a king in David's line. There will be a Messiah to come, and gradually this hope of a Messiah in David's line is just turned up and turned up and turned up as we go through the Old Testament. Chapter 11 is one of those places that this branch will come. We get that elsewhere. This branch from the stump of Jesse, this new king, and this king who will have the Spirit of the Lord resting on him. This king who will do what is right, who will give justice for the poor, who will defeat the wicked. And the result will be this wonderful Eden vibe. The wolf will live with the lamb, the
Mm.
leopard young with the goat. This king will not only restore the people, but will restore all of creation. Verse
Mm.
9, they will neither harm nor destroy on all my holy mountain, for the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea.
Mm.
I mean, yeah, I'm guessing you've got Eden vibes scribbled somewhere around somewhere of that bit. This
Yes.
this is the hope that all will be restored, and in fact, not just be restored, but be even better than before. And we read on
Mm.
in chapter 11, we see this king will bring the people back. It will be a new exodus. Verse
Mm.
16, there will be a highway for the remnant of his people that is left from Assyria, as there was for Israel when they came up from Egypt. Linking,
Mm.
this king will restore the people actually much as God restored the people in the past. So it's one of those moments we both have new promises, just expanding the vision of this Messiah to come, but very much in continuity with old events. God is a God who brings his people out of slavery. And so even when the people find themselves in slavery, even death, God is a God of bringing his people home. God is a God of resurrection. And so, these things are pictured here as this great hope, leading the people to sing a song of joy, much as in Exodus 15, the people sang a song of joy at God's salvation.
I love that. You get a new song of praise
Mm.
for a new form of Exodus, just buried, tucked in chapter 12. But from 13 through to 23, there's a lot of judgment of other nations. Could you just give us a headline on what to do with that? What box do we put that in?
I've preached through Isaiah 40 to the end, but not this first bit. And this is the bit I think I'd struggle, because it seems like, from 13 to, well, beyond 23 even, judgment on all these other nations, and it's all quite similar. And it's one of those moments where I don't think we necessarily read sort of really slowly, verse by verse, what's the lesson here? What's the lesson here? I think rather as a composite picture. All these other nations, many of them were places that Israel, Judah might have looked to for help when faced with threats. We mentioned those two kings, Ahaz, Mr. Fix it in my own strength, make alliances guy, and Hezekiah, Mr. Trust the Lord and pray guy. Part of the reason I think there was all this judgment on the other nations, I mean, partly it's because they're sinful and their sins are catalogued. Partly it's to show, I think, the folly of looking to any of these for help. Why would you trust in Babylon if Babylon's going to be judged by God? Why would you trust in Egypt if Egypt is going to be judged by God? And so when God's people then read these, and I think when we come to them now as Christians, what do we do with all these? I think we can move more quickly. I think, again, it highlights the seriousness of sin. Actually, God's people do just crop up in a few moments in these sections of judgment against the nations, because God's people are sinful. God cares about how people act, how people live, and so the nations will be judged for their behavior. Partly, it gives God people hope that the nations that were oppressing them will be judged. If you are facing constant attack from Assyria, and God says, "I will judge Assyria for their wickedness," you think that is wonderful news. If you're subject to atrocities by another power, and God says, "I will come and I will not let them commit atrocities unpunished," that's good news. So some of these, to see these as good news for God's people, that actually their oppressors won't get away with it. And in one sense, these oppressors represent the oppressor, Satan. God will judge wickedness. Satan has been attacking God's people right from the start. Genesis 3:15. The serpent is attacking the offspring of the woman, but an offspring of the woman will crush his head. And I think to see something of that, God will not let those who attack his people get away with it. God will not let Satan be unpunished. Actually, in one of these prophecies, Babylon is described as the morning star, or Lucifer in the Latin, which is where we get that from. Babylon seems to be almost described in satanic terms.
Wow.
You set yourself in high, thinking you could be king of heaven, to oppose the Most High God, but you will fall. And so in these nations, to see something of God's judgment on evil and Satan, and therefore the folly of looking to any of these places for security rather than trusting the Lord. So probably I kind of step back from the section as a whole and get those messages, rather than necessarily sort of verse by verse exactly what's going on here. I think that's a helpful window. Otherwise, we could easily just stumble and think, well, this is the oracle against Moab. That's a bit like what God said against Philistia, which is a bit like what he said against Damascus. Which these are enemy nations in opposition to God, attacking God's people. It's God's judgment on evil, and God's reminder: don't trust in these nations, and also don't become like them. Think of the Exodus that you mentioned. God's people needed a sacrifice to escape the judgment on the firstborn, because they were sinful as well. It's not like God's people were perfect and these other nations were the sinners. Actually, God's people also would face judgment, and so it can be a reminder of that as well. There's some of the things, but
super helpful, super duper helpful. Thank you. I think I must come bearing a Monday morning moment, and there's so much, but I think the relationality of sin or the relationality of when it goes wrong, as in sin isn't abstract doing something that is not said as good. Sin is so much more this relationship between us and the Lord that was broken in the Garden of Eden and is, this far through the story being looked at more closely and seeing what it looks like for a nation to be sinning so tragically against their good and loving God. It's been more of an emotional connection point for me, I think. Maybe a deeper view of sin, but also that God isn't finished with them. There's too many pops of joy and hope and light for this to be the end of the story. Thankfulness for the Lord that he's still got a plan, even when it is looking pretty murky. How about for you?
I think just what you said at the end there, just hearing you read Isaiah 9, having just discussed the sin and judgment, I just my heart was beating. My pulse was racing just hearing to people who have sinned and stumbled and wandered so far. God says, I'm going to do this. I'm going to send what we know. I'm going to send Jesus. And I just found that incredibly moving. And actually, what confidence when we feel I've blown it. I'm too far gone. I'm too dark. My life. If you knew the skeletons in my closet, if you knew the darkness, and in that context, we hear God say to the people in darkness, "Great light." It's just astonishing. We couldn't make this up. Actually, hearing that passage in the light of human sin just makes God's grace all the richer. So, yeah, that's really warmed my heart today.
I cannot deny how excited I am to get into our next section. And I was scared of Isaiah. I shouldn't have been. You've been good hands to take us through. And our next episode will have us in chapters 24 to 48. The key chapters being 40 to 48. TheBibleOverbrew.com will have notes to give you a hand. Thanks to Good News Broadcasting Association making this recording possible. It's been a joy to be with you. Thank you. Take care. God bless. Goodbye.
Bye.